My father taught me how to shake a man's hand before he taught me how to ride a bike. He said a handshake tells people whether you're worth trusting. 16 years later, in a lawyer's conference room in Millbrook, Tennessee, I watched him reach his hand out to shake mine, and I let it hang there in the air until he understood I wasn't going to take it. Welcome to Dad's Pure Revenge. If you're new here, this is the channel for stories about fathers who got knocked down and got back up on their own terms. Drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one. And if stories like this mean something to you, go ahead and hit subscribe before we get into it, because this one's a long ride. Before I tell you what happened at that reading, you need to understand a man named Frank Doyle. Frank was my mother's older brother. He ran a chain of hardware and auto supply stores across 3 counties. Doyle's Hardware and Supply, 12 locations by the time he passed. Red signs with a yellow wrench on them, the kind of business where the guy behind the counter still remembers your name from 10 years back. Frank built it from one store on Route 9 in a town called Millbrook. He never married, never had kids of his own. What he had instead was a habit of showing up. He showed up at my Little League games, in a company polo, sitting alone in the bleachers with a thermos of black coffee, keeping score in a little notebook, even when nobody asked him to. He showed up the year my school canceled the 8th grade trip to Nashville because 3 families couldn't afford it. Frank paid for all 3 without ever putting his name on it, and it took me 9 years to find out it was him. He was the kind of man who'd hand a store manager a raise in cash on a Friday and tell him not to mention it to payroll because he didn't like paperwork getting between him and doing right by somebody. He wasn't loud about any of it. He just did it, and then he changed the subject. My name is Daniel Marsh. Everybody calls me Danny. I'm 31 now. I run my own electrical contracting business out of Bellevue, and I've got a wife, Rachel, and 2 kids. Emma, who's 7, and Cole, who just turned 4. I coach Cole's t-ball team on Saturdays, badly. I say that because for most of my life, I told myself that showing up for my own kids, the way Frank showed up for me, would fix everything that happened before them. I'm not sure that's true. I think you can build a good life on top of an old wound, and still feel it when the weather changes. That's the flaw I carried into this story, and it's the one I had to finally set down. Here's where it starts. Tuesday, September 3rd, 2010. I was 15 years old, sitting on the front steps of a rented house on Colby Street, with a duffel bag between my feet, because that's what my father told me to pack. 1 duffel bag. I need to back up a little further, because the crisis didn't come out of nowhere. That June, my mother, Carol, had been let go from the accounting office where she'd worked for 11 years. My father, Richard, was between contracting jobs, which happened more than he liked to admit. Money got thin fast. And that August, I did something I'm not proud of. I took $40 out of the coffee can in the kitchen without asking, because I wanted to go to a concert with 2 friends from school, and I was too embarrassed to ask my parents for money I knew they didn't have. I got caught. I confessed within a day. I offered to work it off mowing lawns. None of that mattered. My father didn't yell. That's the part people don't expect when I tell it. He sat at the kitchen table that Tuesday evening, 6:50 by the microwave clock. I remember because I kept staring at it. And he said, "We can't keep managing you on top of managing everything else." He said it flat, like he was reading a weather report. My mother stood by the sink with her arms crossed and didn't say a word to stop him. "So what am I supposed to do?" I asked him. "Figure it out," he said. That was it. Figure it out. 2 words from a man who'd spent my whole childhood telling me a handshake meant something. I didn't understand, at 15, that he'd already decided I was one more expense he couldn't carry. I just knew I had a duffel bag and nowhere to be by nightfall. I called my Uncle Frank from a gas station payphone 2 blocks over, because my cell had already been shut off that month, for the bill going unpaid. It was 8:15 when he picked up. I remember the sound of the highway behind me while I talked, semis going by, and I remember how steady his voice was. "Stay right there," he said. "Don't go anywhere else. I'm 20 minutes out." He was there in 17. He didn't ask me a single question in the truck that night. He just reached over once, gripped my shoulder, and said, "You're not a problem to be solved, Danny. You're just a kid who needs a bed." I've held on to that line for 16 years. If you've ever had somebody show up for you with no conditions attached, hit like on this video right now, because that's exactly the kind of person we're talking about. Frank gave me the guest room over his garage on Rutherford Lane. He drove me to school every morning at 7:10 sharp for the rest of that year, and he never once brought up my parents unless I did first. When I did bring them up, usually late at night, usually asking why, he'd just say, "Some people confuse controlling a house with running one. Don't let it make you bitter. Let it make you different." I didn't fully understand that sentence until I had kids of my own. There was a man named Otis Boyd who worked the counter at Frank's original store on Route 9 for almost 30 years. Otis wasn't family, not by blood. But when I needed a ride to a job interview at 16 because Frank was out of town on business, Otis closed the store 40 minutes early, no manager's permission needed, and drove me himself. When I asked him why he'd do that for a kid who wasn't even his, he just shrugged and said, "Around here, we don't wait to be asked twice." He said some version of that to me for years, every time he helped without being asked. It became a kind of promise between us. My parents didn't call that first year. Not once. I found out later my mother had wanted to, and my father told her it would undermine the lesson. I still don't fully know what lesson he thought a 15-year-old was supposed to learn from a duffel bag and a gas station payphone. They resurfaced when I was 19. Frank had just opened his 8th store, and there was a write-up about him in the Millbrook paper, half a page, with a photograph of him standing in front of the new location. My father called me 2 days after it ran, not to ask how I was. He asked if Frank had set anything up for me yet. I told him I had to go, and I hung up before he could answer. They came around 3 more times over the years. My 24th birthday, the year I started my own contracting business, and the week Emma was born. Each time, my father found a way to steer the conversation toward Frank, never toward me. I noticed it. I want to be honest with you. I noticed it, and I let it slide every single time, because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted him to ask about me instead. I kept waiting for a version of that conversation that never came, and I think that waiting cost me more than the original betrayal did. That's the mistake I own in this story. Not that I got hurt at 15, but that I spent 16 years leaving the door cracked for a man who never once walked through it to see me. Frank passed on a Sunday morning in April, at St. Agnes Medical Center in Bellevue, with me and Rachel in the room. He'd been sick for 8 months and hadn't told hardly anyone, which was exactly like him. He didn't want the stores worrying, didn't want the sympathy. His hand was warm right up until it wasn't. I sat with that for a long while before I called anyone. The funeral was that Thursday. My father showed up in a gray suit I didn't recognize, shook hands with people he'd never met, and made sure, I watched him do it, to introduce himself to Frank's longtime attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt, as Frank's brother-in-law, very close with the family. I stood 20 feet away and said nothing. My mother stood behind him and said even less. 3 days later, my father started calling me. Tuesday it was 2 calls, Wednesday 5. By that Friday it was 11. The following week, it climbed to 29. He wasn't calling to grieve Frank. He wanted to know when the will was being read, and he wanted to know it before I did. If that tells you anything about the kind of man he'd become, or maybe the kind of man he'd always been, and I'd just finally stopped looking away from it. I didn't tell him anything, not because I was scheming. I genuinely didn't know yet. Frank had always been quiet about his finances, the same way he was quiet about everything else he did for people. The reading was set for Thursday, June 18th at 10 a.m. at Pruitt and Lang Law Offices on Vine Street in Millbrook. My father found out the date somehow. I still don't know how. And he called me 38 times in the 4 days before it. I stopped answering after the first dozen. Rachel asked me once, "Are you going to say anything to him when you see him there?" I told her I honestly didn't know yet. I was still figuring that part out myself. Thursday, June 18th, 9:52 in the morning. The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and new carpet. Otis Boyd was there, in a suit I'd never seen him wear, sitting near the back with his hands folded like he was in church. My mother sat beside my father, staring at her lap. My father sat straight-backed, freshly shaved, wearing a tie that still had the fold creases from the package. Gerald Pruitt walked in at 10 o'clock sharp with a manila folder under his arm, and my father stood up before the man had even reached his chair, hand already extended. "Richard Marsh," he said, "Frank's brother-in-law. We were very close." Pruitt shook it politely and sat down without comment. He read through the preliminary matters first. Funeral costs already covered, a handful of personal items to 2 former employees, a modest sum to the Millbrook Public Library Building Fund, because Frank had always said a town without a good library was a town giving up on itself. My father's leg was bouncing under the table the whole time. I could hear his heel tapping the carpet. Then Pruitt got to the business. Doyle's Hardware and Supply, all 12 stores, the real estate underneath 4 of them, and the operating accounts, the whole of it, left in full to me. Not held in trust, not split. Mine, outright, effective immediately, with a clause naming Otis Boyd as general manager of operations for as long as he wanted the job, at a salary Frank had already written in himself. My father's chair scraped back before Pruitt even finished the sentence. "That has to be a mistake," he said. "I'm his brother-in-law. I've been part of this family my whole life. There has to be something for. There isn't a clause naming you, Mr. Marsh," Pruitt said, glancing down at the folder. Frank was specific about that. He updated this document himself 4 years ago, and he was very clear on the language. My father turned to me. "Danny, tell him there's some kind of understanding here." That was the moment. I want to be exact about what happened in me right then. Because it wasn't anger. Not the way you'd think. It was more like a door I'd been holding open with my foot for 16 years finally just swung shut on its own. Quiet, with no slam to it at all. "There's no understanding, Dad," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You handed me a duffel bag when I was 15 and told me to figure it out. I figured it out. This is what figuring it out looks like." "That's not fair," he said. "That was a different time. You were a difficult kid. We were struggling. You called me 38 times in 4 days," I said, "and never once to ask how I was doing. You called to find out what you were owed. Frank called me every Sunday for 16 years, and never once asked me for a thing." Pruitt had gone still, his pen resting on the folder, watching my father the way you'd watch a fire alarm you weren't sure was real. My mother finally looked up, and for the first time in years, I saw something on her face that might have been shame, though I've stopped trying to guess what she's feeling. That's not mine to carry anymore either. My father stood there another moment, hand twitching like he still wanted to reach for something to hold on to. Then he sat back down, and he didn't say another word for the rest of the reading. I signed the paperwork 3 weeks later at the store on Route 9, at the same counter Otis had worked for 30 years. He was behind it that morning, same as always, and when I finished signing he reached over and shook my hand, a real one, the kind my father used to talk about, and never once demonstrated. "Around here," Otis said, "we don't wait to be asked twice." I haven't spoken to my father since the reading. My mother called once, in July, and we talked for 11 minutes, about nothing important. I don't know if that door opens again someday. I'm not holding it shut on purpose, and I'm not holding it open either. I just don't need anything on the other side of it anymore. And that's a strange, plain kind of peace. Not the kind you feel good about, just the kind you can finally stand up straight inside of. Cole asked me last week what Uncle Frank was like, since he never really got the chance to know him. I told him Frank was a man who showed up. I didn't explain the rest. I figure he'll understand it in his own time, the same way I did. If this story meant something to you, I'd ask you to think about the people in your own life who showed up without being asked twice, and maybe tell them so this week. That's the whole lesson, really. Not the money, not the will. Just showing up. If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.